Good evening. Good evening. One more time. Good evening. Thank you. Welcome to the Shoals Marine Laboratory's weekly marine science seminar. I'm Sarah Morris, the John M. Kingsbury Executive Director of the Shoals Marine Lab, and thank you for joining us this evening for our third Rock Talk of this 2024 season. For those of you joining us online who may be new to our lab community, the Shoals Marine Lab is the oldest and largest marine lab in the country that is focused on undergraduate training, both in coursework and in research. The lab is operated jointly by the University of New Hampshire and Cornell University. Our seminars are affectionately called Rock Talks because in the early days of the lab, the seminars and classroom lectures would often be conducted outdoors, literally on the rocks, next to the intertidal. We've migrated indoors, but we still call these weekly seminars a rock talk, and it's a wonderful opportunity for our island community to come together and learn about new and emerging research topics or topics of general interest. In addition to the guests joining us remotely tonight, we have 4 courses on Appledore: marine mammal biology, sustainable fisheries, marine parasites and disease, and R by the Sea. R by the Sea started yesterday. I'm really proud of hearing them join in right away. That's great. In addition to these classes, we also have our summer undergraduate research group, affectionately known as Surges, who are involved in summer-long research projects. Surges? We're excited to have everyone both in person and online for this seminar. The format for this evening's seminar is a 45-minute talk, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. For our friends online, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will read your online questions out loud for the entire audience. For those of you in the comments, we'll pass around a microphone for you and so that everyone can hear. This evening's speaker is Dr. Jessica Bolker, a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of New Hampshire. She received her undergraduate degree in biology from Yale University and her PhD in zoology from the University of California, Berkeley. She completed a postdoc at Indiana University and currently holds an affiliate faculty position in the Department of Philosophy and a faculty fellow position at the Graduate School at the University of New Hampshire. She served as the Associate Director of the Shoals Marine Lab from 2002 to 2011. Her scholarship centers on the epistemology of model use in the developmental and translational research. She teaches courses in developmental biology, evolution, model systems in translational research, scientific writing, and scientific communication. Since 2007, she has taught a marine immersion course here on Appledore in August. This course is available to pre-freshmen who are starting at UNH in the fall, and some of our students this summer were students in that program. She's intellectually interested in a wide range of topics and fields and the connection between science and the arts. In fact, she was responsible for the staging of William Shakespeare's The Tempest on Appledore. Her talk this evening is Here We Are, History, Biology, and the Interconnections on Appledore Island. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Bolker.
Thank you so much, Sarah. The first thing I'm going to say is thanks to all of you guys for being here, and happy birthday, Dad. My dad's online and it's his birthday, so I'm not going to ask you to sing. So I want to acknowledge Sarah for the invitation, and I also had help with this talk from Eleanor Bolker, who was here last week at the banding station, and my UNH colleague Teresa Cohn. Neither of them is responsible for anything I get wrong. If this is coherent, a lot of the thanks. So I'm a faculty member at UNH. I have very long involvement with shoals. I gave a rock talk before. I gave a rock talk in August 1998 as a new faculty member. It was about fish development, which is what I've studied for part of my career. And it ended up with a little bit of conceptual stuff. What's happened since then is I've gotten more and more interested in the conceptual stuff. I don't run a lab anymore. because I've gotten more interested in the questions than the answers. And science is really about both. And I tend to work more on the questions side these days. That's how I ended up affiliated with philosophy. This is not a philosophy talk, I promise. But if that is something you want to talk about later, or at breakfast after I've had my coffee, I'd be delighted to do that. So, as scientists, we often focus on finding the answers. That's what we do when we collect data and do research. But it's also really important to look for the questions and looking at what is around you and where you are is a really good way to do that, particularly here. So what this talk is about is how paying attention to where we are here can generate questions about this particular place and also about some broader issues. So, a couple questions. How does being here lead to questions? And how do some of the key questions about being here? Who's here? Why are we here? And how is it that we managed to be here? How do those answers change? So the strategy for the talk is I'm going to go through some history backwards and see what kinds of questions arise. And part of the core of that is how does being here, what you notice while you're here, shape your questions? Because each of us has come here by some unique path. So I don't want to do all the work. I would like you to, if you have a implement and something to write on, be prepared to do that. Because this isn't only about my questions. And I hate it when you get to the end of the talk and you say, are there any questions? And everybody goes, can I go work on my project now? So there will be some opportunities for you to actually write down some questions. So we are here, although Higgins Commons isn't here. This is a map that was drawn in 1931, quite possibly by a UNH marine biologist. So here we are on a rock. And that observation immediately raises some very basic questions. Who's here? Mostly who's here is undergraduates. That's actually unusual for a marine lab these days. And there's a historical explanation for that I'll get to. There are also faculty here, there are researchers here, and absolutely critically, there are island staff here. Because without those folks here, none of the rest of us could be. So thank you. So why are we here? We're here because it's a field station. And by being here, you have proximity to what you're studying. Marine or parasites or fish or whatever. We come here to study what's here. And we all come with different experience, different disciplinary knowledge, different perspectives. So part of why we come here is to all be in the same room, or at least on the same rock. And to learn from each other and from those connections and those intersections and what people are bringing, because what you're bringing shapes the kinds of questions you ask when you get here. So here's an anecdotal example. I first got here as a new faculty member because the then director of the lab thought a good way to recruit faculty would be I invite them out to get a rock talk, because once they see this place, they're gonna look back. He wasn't wrong. So when I got here, a new faculty member, that's fine, but I also did a lot of theater tech in high school, and I almost majored in English in college. And I'm pulling into the harbor, and I go, how cool would it be to do Shakespeare's Ireland play? That's literally the first question I asked when I got here. I didn't like to tell anybody else. but we did. So we actually had a production of The Tempest on this island. We did it kind of down there, downhill towards Sandpiper Beach from Celia's garden. So take a minute to think about either what questions occurred to you when you got here, or what questions got you here in the first place. Well, why? What's your why for being here? Okay. So we did the who. We're doing some why. Then there's the how. This is a rock. One of the absolutely critical assets of this rock is it has water. This was noted by the first sentences in the earliest European reports. They also noted there wasn't enough soil to farm, and there were no trees, and the harbor wasn't all that great, but there was water. We're still using the well from the Victorian Rebellion. So there's water, but we got it here. And that's always been true. So answers to a lot of the how questions, how we can be on this rock, is infrastructure. And a lot of the answers to a lot of those questions are related to sustainability initiatives, which have been going on out here really intensively for 15 years. And I love that you can now see a lot of it online. So you can answer a lot of the how questions. Where's power coming from? Via the dashboard. And part of the answer to how do we do this has been paying attention and collecting data about our water use, our power use, and then asking questions about how can we do it better? How can we use less water? How can we get more solar? And so on. And related to that is then, of course, well, could we use this as a lab for engineers? I mean, obviously it's a lab for marine biologists, but it's also a lab for engineers. And that turns out to be part of the answer to how. So the lovely building, known as the Water Conservation Building, is there in part because student engineering interns, undergraduates, collected the data that went into the NSF proposal that got the money to build. So the pieces come together here in some really cool ways. I've been coming out here long enough to know, to have seen some of that trajectory. We've been downsizing generators. When I told my friend and colleague David Richmond, who was Prospero in the Tempest, that I was coming out, he said that we weren't running generators much anymore. One of the challenges of doing that production the year we did it was there were generators. It'd be really cool to do it now because that wouldn't have been it. So part of it, it's new technology. It's more solar, it's more information, it's more solar, it's better composting, it's LED lights, it's better batteries. Get to that at the end. But there are some constants. One of the constants is that human behavior has always mattered. It doesn't really matter, well, it does matter, but it doesn't help to have great systems if people are sloppy. We've gotten away with having not always great systems because people are careful. And it's also true that a lot of the infrastructure, like the well, dates back to the founding of the modern iteration of the Shoals Marine Lab in mid-1960s. So that's where we're going to go next. I told you I was going to do history. So here we go. The key questions in the early 60s were how to get undergrads access to marine. This is like Jacques Cousteau, and all of a sudden, marine biology is crazy popular and everybody wants to do it. There are not enough spots at places like the marine biology. And undergrads are not getting sweet. And Jack Kingsbury thought that was not okay. And he was right. So one question was just how to get undergrads access. And then the next question was where and how to do it. and how to do it on an island, on this island in particular. So Jack Kingsbury from Cornell, Prof. Jackson, Floyd Jackson from UNH, handful of other faculty, plus a local contractor and a bunch of very energetic students, built this one. Why here? Jack had spent time on Star. Star actually had a little marine lab. And Shoals actually technically started there in 1966, moved on Appledore in 73. But there was this mostly abandoned island next door. That's what this place looked like. That's the kinds of structures they were starting. There had been a marine lab here, and I'll get to that in a minute. So as far as the how, Jack wrote a book about that, which, if you haven't read it, I actually think that anybody who's going to spend any substantial amount of time out here needs to read this book. You can listen to it too. They actually recorded Jack reading it. So I recommend it highly, and I saw there were some copies in the store. And then there's the noticing part. So what are things from that era that we can still notice around here now? Notice. What is this? An awful lot of stuff named Kingsbury. Really? Remember how Sarah introduced herself? There's a boat. There's a house. There are scholarships. There are professorships. There are all kinds of things named Kingsbury. This building is one of the things we can notice from them. So is the PK Lab. So the major modern infrastructure was built in that era. Also, the intertidal transit locations around the island, the ones that are spray painted on the rocks. Jack set those up in about 1970. So that again is a signature you can notice here now that dates from then. And then there are really important parts of culture out here. Remember how you unloaded the boat? Everybody lined up. That's how they unloaded boats in 1972. So there are some constants about how we all collectively make this place that are still going and are rooted then. This is what we don't see. This is important. What you see is important. What you don't see is very important. In 1974, this almost happened. This is an enormous oil terminal. That's what nearly was here. And on Adams Point. There's a lot of really interesting history. I'm supposed to finish this talk in 45 minutes, so I'm just going to point at it. But these women are why it didn't happen. So Dudley, who was an early New Hampshire state rep, right at the beginning of her career in the legislature, Phyllis Bennett and Mensa Sandberg. They're most of the reason it didn't happen, but Jack Kingsbury helped too. It was early days of the lab, and he was talking about what it would do to this place if there was no refinery. So he wrote a book about it, which is in the store, and I think it's $1. There's also a fairly recent book by my UNH colleague David Moore called Small Town Big Oil, which is an easy read and will tell you a lot about these people who founded a citizens group called Save Our Shores. If you want to know a whole lot more, you should go to the UNH archives because there are boxes of the original documents from that successful fight against siting an oil refinery here. That raises all kinds of questions. If it raises any questions in your head, take a minute and write it. I'm not promising to answer, but I think it's a good answer. So there wasn't an oil refinery, but what was here before? And this place was trash when Jack came out here and started putting this land together. Well, we can still see some of what was there before. So one of the most noticeable things on this island was here before the Shoals Marina. It's in this picture from 1946. What do you see here that's still here? The tower. Yeah. So it had all this other stuff on top of it, which I didn't even know. But yeah, the radar tower was built by military in 1940, World War II. Military took over the island to watch for German submarines, for U-boats, potentially attacking, targeting the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which you probably noticed on your way out, I hope, from the boat. So they built the tower. The original water distribution system for the lab was they pumped stuff up into a tank up in the tower, and then they gravity fed it down to the buildings. And it was pretty low tech. The way they knew the tank was full was when water started running down the outside of the tower. They turned the pump on. So yeah, it worked. So I said the military threw everybody off the island. Thrown off. There was a Marine before UNH had a marine zoological laboratory here on this rock between 1928 and 1920. So this is Floyd Jackson. Prof Jackson. He was a Midwesterner, and for some reason he came to the University of New Hampshire, and he decided he really liked saltwater. So he started doing marine ecology, and he was the chair of the zoology department, which was then in the College of Liberal Arts. And he launched the Marine Zoological Laboratory on this rock in 1928. So who was Prof Jackson and some of his colleagues, a bunch of UNH undergrads, and they were housed mostly in what we now refer to as founders, which is what you see right out that window. So that's still here. And they also use latent, especially for lab space. The why was largely the same as yours, as ours. So this is their, the bulletin of the University of New Hampshire. And the title of the picture is Fresh Material for the Anatomy Laboratory. So what's that on the back? You come out here because you can do stuff like pull things out of the oceans. That's not new. That's why they were. And the other reason they were here, it's the reason I like coming here, is because of the people and the community. So that's a class picture. The alums from that era called themselves the Barnacles. I think they were people who stuck on the rock in clusters. And they had a very active alumni association, decades. And the reason it says level 1 over there is that's a photo of a sign in the UNH library. Level 1 houses the Milne Special Collections and University Archives. There are boxes of barnacle stuff. You can find out what classes were being taught, who was in them, and the plays that they put on, and the music they had for their concert evenings, and all the goofy stuff that they were doing out here when they weren't doing the sections. So it's really interesting socially. The other thing I think is interesting is the ways the curriculum overlaps with the kinds of things we do out here now. They were not doing R by the sea, but the other stuff that you guys are doing, yeah. So the reasons for being at field station, the access to specimens and habitats have very, very deep roots here. They also have embryology, histology. That hasn't been on the Shoals Marine Complex in quite a while. So the buildings that they used actually dated from an earlier period. But before we go there, I just want to take a quick look at things you can notice now that are from that era, from the Marine Zoological Lab. So there's the class picture again. Where are they? They're sitting on the steps of Leighton. You've probably done that too. So the class photo sitting on the steps, use of that building, that goes back. What's the middle? Photograph with the reflections. Anybody recognize that? It's in Leighton. What is it? It's the world's smallest museum of the Shoals Marine Lab. It's in the lobby in Leighton. It's worth looking at. I didn't put a picture of the Jackson lab on here, but just like there's lots of stuff named Kingsbury, there's also lots of stuff named Jackson from Floyd Jackson. When the military threw him and his crew off this island, he started studying Great Bay. And he was one of the first people to do really thorough ecological data collection surveys, analysis at Great Bay. So UNH's estuarine lab on Great Bay is the Jackson. I would be very surprised if anybody knows exactly what those weird things are. You know what sort of things? They're emerald. They're not chicken. When I got to UNH, I inherited a large and almost completely disorganized collection of teaching materials. There were some glass slides and specimens in that collection that were dated from the 30s, and they're turn embryos. And they were made by students. Picked up those slides, and the first time I said, what? Now I know. So that's from the embryology classes and histology classes that were out here. So there are things you can notice. And again, lots of cool things in the articles. There are also question systems for me. I mean, I'm curious about what was the footprint, what were the impacts? There were about 50 in that area, in the how did the curriculum compare? The other thing that's in the archives from the 1928 to 1945 are field notebooks. There are field notebooks, people observing and doing experiments, collecting data on this island that are sitting in the basement of Diamond Library in Durham, New Hampshire, that you can get your hands on. There's gotta be some good stuff that you can work with. So just write down. Right, now we're going to get to the famous part that you've probably heard of. This is what most people know about this island. The buildings that the barnacles used, that we still use, Leighton and Founders, are from the most famous period out here, the hotel era. It was really different. And there were a lot of people here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who and why and how. Part of the how is, so I pulled both of these things out of UNH archives. And when I started to put the slide together, I went, oh my gosh, it's the same boat. If you look on the brochure, you could get on a steamship in Boston and come straight in. And if you look at the boat there, and then you look over the photograph, that's the boat. So that was really fun. So it looked different. Who was here? Bunch of people. There were a lot of tourists here. There were also like the famous celebrity writers and artists and musicians of the era, especially famously Celia Thaxter, who you've probably heard of, and Child Hassan, who was a very well-known early American Impressionist painter. They were buddies. That's Celia's house down at the bottom, and that's her garden around it. You know where that is, right? It's down the hill. You can see it. So they were buddies, and when Celia wrote this book, An Island Garden, there are copies in the bookstore, had some illustrations. So they had a really good symbiotic relationship. Celia was very famous in her time, partly as a writer. I do not recommend her literary output. I read a lot of Victorian stuff. I don't read that. What she was brilliant at was bringing people together. She would get the artists and the writers and the painters and the musicians, and they would like hang out at her house and talk to each other and drink tea and drink whatever all else they would drink. Convening people was a big part of what this place was about, and still is a big part. So people came then, for advertising, healthy. They came for the scenery and for the intellectual community. This was one of the first artists' colonies in the United States in the mid-1800s. So artists came here to work, and musicians and hotel guests came to play and to shoot. So in this era, the why people were here was mostly vacation. And here's the how question that I have been really thinking about. The Layton, so Celia Thaxter was Celia Layton Thaxter. It was her dad, Thomas Layton, who started the hotel. And then her brothers ran it. How did they do that? They had 500 people at this hotel. It was a luxury hotel. They were not camping out. They had 100 staff as well as 500 at the hotel. And they had kayaks, and they had boardwalks, and they had tennis courts, and they had a saltwater swimming pool, and they had celebrities. So this picture is actually Child Passam, like being scenic, with a couple of unnamed women hotel guests. If you look at what the women are wearing, you understand why they had boardwalks between the cottages and the hotel, because big skirts were a thing. There is documentation of like what the menus were. I would love to know how the heck they ran that. And I think a lot of that information is probably sitting in this. Probably some of it in the Portsmouth Athenaeum, probably some of it in the there are a lot of letters that people describing their visits to the island. You can see it was really different. And you know, it was like a luxury vacation place. So what is there from then to now that we can notice? Some things we notice are transformations. So my daughter was out here last week working at Fanny State, which was great because I could text her and say, I found this picture in the archives. Can you go stand up in the garden and take the same picture now? Which she did, which I really appreciate. So in the hotel era, that's standing there and kind of looking this way. The building you see on the far right in the hotel era picture is that building. That's the picture Eleanor took last week. And lots of things have been transformed. The landscape looks different. Place names are also different. Thomas Layton decided that Hog Island was not going to be attractive, so he named it Appledore. But there are traces. The flora and the fauna are also different than they were. There have never been trees here, but it was raised. They had sheep. There were not poison ivy trees. It looks different. It's much wilder now. It was very intensively civilized then. So there's been a lot of transformation. Some things persist. Layton persists. Layton and founders were cottages that were part of the hotel. But they're the same things. How many of you seen this? That's like stunty little tree in front of Layton. You know what kind of tree that is? There are apple trees on this, but most of them are well over 100 because they're from that era. They're old varieties and they're kind of hanging out, but salt water is not great for apple trees. So that is a very old apple tree, but it's not a very large apple tree. But it probably goes back that far. There have also been some reconstructions. So the most famous one is the garden itself, which Jack Ginsburg decided he wanted to read Celia's book and make the garden again. So he started that. But also there was a very cool project, which was spearheaded in part by Hal Weeks, the historic lab, who's a marine biologist, by the way, by training, marine ecologist. He'll probably kill me for saying this. He's here on Zoom. His PhD dissertation from Cornell, there's a copy of it in the library. That's pretty fun. Anyway, while Hal was out here working, he had this fun project that he was just of going around the island, trying to figure out where Child Hassan was sitting when he painted different famous paintings of Appledore and mapping places. And this kind of spiraled into a project with some museum curators. And what they ended up doing was rounding up all or almost all the paintings that Hassan painted out here and figuring out where he was. So the central image is the cover of the book, it's a catalog in the exhibit. And it's got plates in it that show a painting and then the photograph now of the same place. And the map, what you see in the map on the right, is the mapping out of, for plate 1, which is this, it's a view of Bab's Rock. So there's a 1 on Bab's Rock, and Hassan was sitting on Celia Thaxter's front porch when he painted it. That's where the view lines up. The other thing you see on that map is what the hotel complex is. It was yes. So I think if any occur to you, this would be the time to recommend. Because next we're going to talk about it. So we're going to take another step back. Before the island was renamed Appledore, back to Forest, it was a very different place with very different people. And they were here for different reasons. For the previous couple of centuries, the why people were here was fish, especially this fish. So what fish is this? What kind of fish? The juvenile. It's a cod. And actually, you probably can't read the signature from there, but it was drawn by Celia Thaxter's brother, Oscar. And it's in the UNH archives. I had to pick up the piece of paper with this fish drawing. Okay, so this is Oscar's cod drawing. This is a 1652 European map. And the Isles of Shoals are featured prominently. This place was important to Europeans in the 1600s. And the who and the why there is Europeans had already used up their own fish. They had massively depleted fish stocks in closer parts of the Atlantic Ocean, let alone the North Sea. So they were coming here to fish. This is an artist, Bill Parlberg, who has been an artist in residence out here. It's his reconstruction of what it might have looked like. So who is here are people who are catching and processing fish. Why they're here is fish. And then there's the question of how can we figure out what the fisheries are like and how that shapes what the fisheries are like? Yeah. If those of you in the sustainable fisheries class know that there's a really important time axis for this. So part of how we can know is archaeology. There are artifacts that people find out here, like really big fish hooks. And there's a book called Under the Isles of Shoals, Archaeology and Discovery on Smutty Nose Island. I'm sorry, it's not Appledore, but most of the archaeological work has been done on Smutty Nose for a variety of reasons, including West Poison Ivy. And Bill Parlberg actually did this watercolor and a subsequent one I'll show you for this book. So that's one kind of evidence. But there are also other kinds of evidence that can help us figure out backwards what the fisheries were. There's archaeological. There are documents in archives. So that's a ship log, journal of a fishing voyage. They wrote down where they were, what year they were using, what the weather was like, how long they were fishing, what they caught. There are also visual things like this photograph of this sad looking young child and some very little fish. There are not a lot of fish that big. We took them out of the gene pool a long time ago. Even if stocks rebuild, you don't necessarily get back what you had. And even when you look, you can see it in art museums. So the painting, the center image is a book cover by my recently retired historian colleague, Bolker, at UNH. Did a brilliant retrospective analysis of shifting baselines, technology, and the conversations around sustainable or unsustainable fisheries in the age of sail. And he chose this 1885 Winslow Homer painting called Fog Warning in Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And what you see there is a guy in a dory who's worried about getting back to the main ship because there's fog bank coming in. And man, that's a big fish. You wouldn't catch fish that big here now. Again, thinking back and thinking about how we can think raises some interesting questions. So, as we go, if they occur to you, write them down. So for that era, there's not necessarily obvious kinds of data, but there's a lot of data. But of course, Europeans described discovering the islands as though nobody had known they were here until they got here. Smith named them after himself in 1614. There's a glacier kind of overall in this until about 12,000 years ago. And when the glacier receded, the sea level was actually a lot lower. So originally this was connected to the mainland, separated from the mainland about 7,000 years ago. But the islands would have been much more clearly visible from the coast at that point. And there's other evidence like the petrified forest at O'Neill. And the people who lived in this part of the world built boats and knew how to use them. So this is another Bill Parburn image. Note, same word as imagine. So thinking about what it might have looked like out here. What's that creature in the lower right? It's a great auk. You see those out here anymore? But they were. And there's a variety of good evidence for it. It looked different, but we have a lot less data than from other periods, at least so far. We know it was different. There were animals here then that aren't here now. We know there were people here, but we don't know much. So here's the who question. Who was here then? And the thing that gets me about this is we're only recently recognizing that these are questions we should be asking. Most standard history of the Isles of Shoals starts in 1614. There were people out here before the Europeans and their rats arrived. And we have a lot to learn about why and how they were present on this island. So I think this is an interesting question. I've got all kinds of stuff I can show you about the hotel era and something. There's not nearly as much. Partly, it's because we haven't even started asking, or we've only recently started asking. And we have to look in the right ways and places. So when they started doing the archaeological work on smutting those, they didn't find any indigenous artifacts. They didn't find any flakes or spear points or arrowheads or anything. And then they thought about the sea level. They realized that the coastal part, what was then the coastal part, is now underwater. So they just weren't digging it They started looking for deeper horizons and they started finding stuff. So these images are from that archaeology book that I showed you the cover of. So trying to figure out what were the connections to mainland populations, cultures, data sources. There were abundant marine resources. There were lots of reasons to be here. And the stone tools, the pottery shards, stone plates that they found so far suggest there was seasonal hunting and food preparation and probably storage out here, or at least out on Smutty Nose, so probably here too. 6,000 years ago. So we're starting now to ask the question and look for the answers. And that kind of brings us back to now. And this is just grabbed from the website of the Isles and Shoals Historical Research Association. And they've done, I don't know how much about hotelier and Celia Paxton. So this fall, their big conference is on, yeah, and what about the people? Who was here? Why were they here? How was it? So this kind of brings us back. Part of what we do out here is learn stuff. That's good. But another part of what we do out, this place is really good for, is noticing what's around us and asking questions. So I've been coming out here since 1998, and I keep noticing new things and coming up with more questions. So I'm just going to dump some of them. So such as the animation decides work, doesn't, you'll just have to imagine. Okay, one question, what can we learn here about sustainable energy? How is this a lab for engineers? What ecological things might we be able to figure out from historical transecting and field notes? There's multiple decades of data from those intertidal transects, and their field notes for 100 years old. What could we learn about ecology on that kind of practice? How do the latents run that? And can we learn things from that about how to support a smaller population on the island? Part of people in 1860 didn't expect to take a shower every day. Not telling you that what they were doing was all wonderful and sustainable. They were undoubtedly heating that place with whale oil lamps, at least initially. Again, this is one of the things that I know the answer is no, and it's just not nice. Could we learn how not to overfish the fish that are left? A whole bunch of you are out here to figure that out. Right? And what kinds of evidence could help shed light, help us better understand Indigenous presence on this one in different time periods? Now, I want to push if we could do the temperature. Especially, you wouldn't have to shout it over the generators. But, you know, that's just me. Point being, everybody's got it. Now, the other thing that's cool about this place is there's probably somebody you can ask. So I got an email a couple days ago to Ross Hansen with some of my engineering questions. I said, Ross, where are we at? I said, well, here are the latest fuel use data. 2020 doesn't count for this go. And then what you see is 2021, 918 gallons, 2022, 756. It was a very sunny summer. So where was power? Solar. 2023, way more. It rained a lot. We weren't getting nearly so much. So what do? Well, last fall, they just about quadrupled battery storage available on the island, which means there's more nights the generator doesn't go on. I almost was able to say, here, they haven't turned the generator on since they opened on May 9th. But that changed 2 days. Oh, we're close, we're close. Part of it, the technology keeps improving. So we're upgrading the batteries in lead acid. It's partly the quantity of batteries, but it's also better batteries. And what's next is more solar to get through those periods without needing to turn on generators. So here's where we are. I'm going to ask you a couple questions. How many people wrote something down? Some kind of. I'm not going to call on you. So just like, I just want to know. All right, it's good. Like 60%. Any volunteers? Right, there are several people in this room whose names I know, and I'm not gonna pick them, because that's just not fair. So then where I will leave this is whether there are questions out there that I or anybody else in the room might be able to answer this. Because as I said, I'm better at questions than answers, but my gosh, I've learned a lot of history. So I'm gonna leave it there. And I don't know if there's questions on Zoom, but you're gonna tell me if there are.
So to begin with, we do have comments on Zoom. Robin has said, we just weren't excavating in the place most used by Native people at the start, relating back to Smutty Nose and finding any of the evidence of Indigenous peoples. And she also wrote, and I believe this was done during the first of your pencil slides, how do we best preserve a record of changing baselines on Appledore since SML has been here?
So the answer to that. So one of the things I would say is we don't have a time machine, but sometimes looking places that might not have been part of your disciplinary training. Like if you're a fisheries biologist, you might not think of looking in archives, but you could find a lot of stuff. So it's both preserving and thinking about where data might exist that you might not have thought of. You got it?
That's all we had online, I think. Question from the room?
Person in the corner with the hat. Oh, I guess I wait for Sarah to bring you the mic, and then we know who gets to speak.
So at the beginning, you asked us why did we want to come to Shoals? So my question for you is, what brought you to Shoals?
That's a great question. I had no idea what was out here. The then director, who was Jim Lauren, really wanted to get more UNH faculty to teach out here, be out here. He was some smart guy. He knew that if he got you out here once, you were going to want to come back. So he said, oh, well, I'll invite new UNH faculty to give the rock talk. And I came out here, I saw this place. And between then and when I actually had an official excuse to be out here as the associate director, every year I would look up what all the classes were. And I would email each of the instructors and say, I could give guest lecture in your class on fish development, on this. And I did that here. I emailed Sarah and I said, I know I get to come out and teach for a week in August, but that's not enough. So which classes could I give a guest lecture in? And she said, well, I have a hole in the Rock Talk schedule. So part of what gets me out here is the people I connect with, the marine biologists who are figuring out where Child Hassan was sitting, the fisheries biologists who are looking in archives, the artists who are seeing things and teaching scientists to see things. And students, honestly.
Thank you so much again for your talk. And I was wondering if you could give a little bit more information about the Save Our Shores campaign, because I feel like now there's a lot of like awareness like surrounding ocean conservation, but it's still so hard to like actually get stuff done in the government. So like, how are they able to do it all the way back then and make such a huge impact when like there wasn't as much awareness as say now is with like social media and everything?
That is a fantastic question. I'm going to try and be brief because it's not my expertise. I am going to vehemently encourage you to read David Moore's book or Jack Kingsbury's book. New Hampshire's a weird state. I know we're in Maine, but UNH, New Hampshire's just over there. And the other end of this project was Adams Point in Durham. So it was politically, the issue was playing out in the state of New Hampshire. And in the 1970s, there was this major oil crisis crunch. There were lines at gas stations. So people were very sensitive to oil supply, fuel supply. So the idea of having lots more fuel, I mean, that's a win. How they did it is a small group of not very experienced, but very passionate citizens, particularly these three women, started talking to people, started digging, found out what was really going on. Like Aristotle Onassis, the tycoon, was the person who was behind this project. And he had sent henchmen to knock on doors on Adams Point because he was going to need like 60% of Adams Point as the terminals. The idea was tankers would pull up here and then they'd do pipelines over to Adams Point. And some of them said, I want to build a cottage. Some of them said, I want this land for hunting. Some of them said, I want this land for preservation. And it was all very under the radar. And then people started to realize something was going on and they started to make a statement. So Save Our Shores was a citizen organization. Phyllis Bennett and her then husband, who left her in the middle of this whole thing, published a local broadsheet, very hyper-local newspaper called Public Occurrences. And they started publishing, and this was sort of the social media of the time. Like it was all really local news, so everybody local read it. The then New Hampshire governor was totally in Onassis' pocket. Jack Kingsbury came on as the marine ecologist. So a bunch of local individuals brought whatever they had to bring to the table. Dudley Dudley was a freshman legislator, freshman or maybe second year in the New Hampshire legislature. So she was learning about how the levers of government worked and how politics worked in the state. Phyllis was the editor of this newspaper. Jack was a marine biologist. Durham's a small town. It's still a small town. They were bringing their networks, their skills, whatever outlets or tools or assets they had, and they were making a lot of noise and they were learning a lot. They did deep dives into what are the rules around this? How does town meeting run? How do you get people to show up for town meeting? Because Durham has a town meeting government. Residents of town Durham can vote and do. All of the papers are in the basement of the UNH library. And the book, Small Town Big Oil, is a very readable summary. The anniversary of this victory over big oil was just a few years ago. Still, there was actually really good news coverage. So you can Google it and learn it. But what it was ultimately about was people saying, this matters too much for me to let this get this. What am I bringing to the table here? What levers can I put my hands on? How am I going to affect this? And I think that's a really important lesson. All right, long answer.
First, let me say thank you very much, and I really enjoyed that. I don't know if you can answer this question, but my question that I wrote down on the bunch was, when did the seagulls arrive?
I know part of the answer. During the hotel era, there were almost none. In the mid to late 1800s, there were no blackbacks south of the Bay of Fundy. There's a whole nother story here, which is one of the things that my colleague Teresa Cohen told me I could not fit into this talk, about changes in seabird populations. And Sarah knows more about it than I do anyway. But a couple of the key pieces are our presence and behavior and the gulls' presence and behavior is very deeply intertwined. Because a lot of the resources they depend on, from stuff from the fishing industry to open garbage dumps on the mainland, are about us. So, when fishing industry crashes, there are fewer resources for gulls. When we have garbage dumps, there are more resources for gulls. The other thing that was going on back in the 1800s was this huge fashion to have big chunks of birds, particularly things like egrets, on your hat if you were a fashionable. So a lot of these birds went nearly to extinction. That's actually when the Audubon Society was founded. That was the impetus for this now big deal, famous bird conservation group. Was too many people walking around with birds on their heads, and the birds getting destroyed. So I don't know the exact history of the gulls, so I'm going to tell you to be asking.
We'll do one more question. Yeah, Joe, I'm coming over.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, how has the island changed due to like erosion or like composition of like the coast here, just due to like climatic effects?
I only know small scale because I'm a frequent visitor, but I'm not a geologist. So in the time I've been coming here, you see erosion. There have been a couple of big storms where Appledore's turned into two islands temporarily. David Buck or other folks in the room or on Zoom may be better equipped than I am to answer that question.
All right, I want to thank Dr. Bolker for coming and giving us quite a history of the islands and a different way of thinking and asking questions about the islands. She's got a lot of background and history here. She'll be here through tomorrow breakfast. I think she's going to be having breakfast with the Surge group. So if anybody else wants to ask questions, she'll be here for a little bit this evening. I want to thank everybody on Zoom for tuning in, and reminder that next week we have our fourth Rock Talk given by our very own Jan Factor, who literally wrote the book about lobsters, and we'll be speaking next week. So thank you all very much.